In 1898, a series of urban planning reports published across Europe and North America described what officials called the modernization of city transport. Horse-drawn systems were replaced, rail standards were unified, and entire street networks were redesigned. The language used in these reports was calm and administrative. The changes were presented as necessary steps towards efficiency and progress. When I began examining city maps from just a few decades earlier, I noticed something that was not addressed in these documents. Entire transport grids, dense networks of rails, depots, bridges, and stations had existed before modernization, then disappeared. In many cases, there was no detailed explanation of how or why they had been removed. Photographs from the late 19th century show streets already fitted with rails before the arrival of officially recognized transit companies. Stations appear far larger than the populations they supposedly served. Bridges, tunnels, and depots were dismantled or repurposed without records explaining their original function. These systems are rarely discussed today. They are simplified in museums and educational materials as primitive predecessors to modern transport. Yet their scale, uniformity, and sudden disappearance raise a question that extends beyond infrastructure. If these networks were inefficient, why were they so widespread, and why were they erased so completely, just as modern systems emerged? The accepted explanation: primitive transit before progress. When I began my research, I started with the official explanation presented in transport history and planning archives. According to the accepted narrative, early urban transport grids were inefficient, fragmented systems designed primarily for horse-drawn trams. These networks are described as experimental, transitional, and ultimately inadequate for growing industrial cities. Historians explain that early rails were laid to reduce friction for animal-powered transport. Cars were lightweight, speeds were limited, and routes were short. As populations increased, these systems allegedly became congested, unsanitary, and expensive to maintain. Their replacement by standardized electric railways and later automotive roads is framed as inevitable. Planning documents from the late 19th century emphasize uniform gauge standards, centralized scheduling, and increased carrying capacity. The narrative suggests older networks lacked coordination and could not scale. In this view, modernization was not only logical but unavoidable. I examined museum exhibits and educational materials that present early transport as rudimentary. Diagrams often depict isolated tram lines rather than interconnected grids. Stations are depicted as modest structures, temporary in nature. The emphasis is on limitation rather than capability. The language used in official sources reinforces this perspective. Early systems are described as outdated, inefficient, or obsolete. Their removal is framed as a correction rather than a loss. Rarely do these sources provide detailed schematics of how the networks actually functioned. What struck me was how little attention was paid to infrastructure beyond the vehicles themselves. Rails, depots, bridges, and tunnels are treated as passive components, easily replaced when technology advanced. The assumption is that nothing of value was lost. This explanation relies heavily on linear progress. Each system is portrayed as an improvement over the last, with no overlap or alternative paths. older networks are reduced to stepping stones towards modern transit. Yet even within this framework, certain questions remain unaddressed. If early systems were truly inefficient, why were they constructed at such scale? Why invest in dense networks spanning entire cities if they were destined to fail within a generation? The official explanation is coherent, but coherence does not equal completeness. It establishes a baseline narrative, one that I accepted initially, but it leaves certain structural details unexplored. As I moved beyond summaries and began examining physical remnants and archival plans, that narrative began to show strain. As I examined surviving infrastructure and historical records, I began to notice inconsistencies that the accepted explanation did not fully account for. These were not isolated anomalies, but recurring features across different cities. One of the first things I noticed was station size. Many early transport stations were built on a scale that far exceeded documented passenger demand. Platforms were long, ceilings were high, and structural reinforcements suggested expectations of sustained, heavy use. In some cases, stations rivaled those built decades later for electric rail. Rail spacing also raised questions. In several cities, rails were laid with density that would have been unnecessary for slow, horse-drawn traffic. Tracks ran parallel along wide corridors, intersecting at regular intervals. This configuration suggests planning for high throughput rather than occasional transit. I also encountered structures labeled vaguely as powerhouses or service buildings in municipal records. These facilities were often located along rail lines but lacked clear documentation of their function. Their construction materials and internal layouts did not align neatly with animal-based transport. Bridges and tunnels presented another inconsistency. Many were over-engineered relative to the loads they were said to carry. Stone arches and steel spans were designed for durability well beyond what lightweight trams required. The official explanation describes this as overcautious engineering, yet the consistency of this pattern across cities raises questions. Route placement also complicated the narrative. Some lines ran through areas with low residential density while bypassing more populated neighborhoods. If demand alone dictated design, these choices are difficult to explain. I examined renovation records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When systems were upgraded, certain components were removed entirely rather than adapted. Rails were buried instead of reused. Depots were dismantled rather than converted. The stated reasons were often vague: modernization, safety, or redundancy. None of these observations prove that early transport systems were advanced or unconventional, but together they challenge the idea that these networks were merely crude or short-sighted. Decorative inefficiency does not require oversized stations. Transitional systems do not usually receive permanent infrastructure. At this stage, I could not claim an alternative explanation. What I could say was that the official narrative did not fully account for what was physically present. The infrastructure itself suggested intentions that extended beyond temporary experimentation. This realization prompted me to expand the scope of my research beyond individual cities. Global patterns across cities and continents. When I compared transport layouts across different regions, patterns began to emerge that were difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Cities separated by geography, culture, and political systems displayed remarkably similar transport designs. In Europe, early rail grids often radiated from central hubs, forming dense networks that covered entire urban areas. In North America, Cities developed comparable layouts even when their growth histories differed significantly. In parts of Asia, early tram systems followed similar spacing, station placement, and construction standards. The timelines were also striking. In many cases, these networks appeared within narrow historical windows and were dismantled in similarly short periods. The overlap between regions suggests coordination or shared assumptions rather than independent experimentation. Construction methods reinforced this impression. Railbeds, tunnel profiles, and station designs followed comparable proportions. Materials varied based on local availability, but structural logic remained consistent. I examined maps showing streets before and after transport removal. In many cities, roads appear to have been built around existing rails rather than the other way around. Later road networks inherited the geometry of earlier systems even after the rails themselves were removed. Another pattern emerged when I examined disaster records. Floods, fires, and earthquakes often preceded major transport redesigns. In several cities, removal of rail networks followed closely after such events, under the banner of reconstruction. What I found most notable was the absence of public debate. Transport systems that spanned entire cities would have affected daily life profoundly, yet newspapers and municipal archives rarely document controversy over their removal. The transition appears to have been administrative rather than public. Across regions, the language used to justify dismantling was similar. Systems were labeled obsolete or inefficient without detailed evaluation. The uniformity of this language suggests a shared framework for decision-making. At this point, the question shifted. Instead of asking why individual systems failed, I began asking whether they were ever intended to function independently. The patterns suggested integration, networks designed to operate as parts of larger systems rather than isolated lines. This line of inquiry led directly to the question of how these networks were meant to function. As I examined the evidence collectively, a system-level interpretation began to shape. The transport grids I was studying appeared less like fragmented experiments and more like components of integrated networks. Routing logic was the first clue. Lines were not arranged solely to serve residential demand. Instead, they followed patterns that optimized flow across entire cities. Intersections were designed for continuous movement rather than terminal stops. This suggests planning for coordination rather than convenience. Energy assumptions also warrant examination. While official accounts emphasize animal power, infrastructure choices imply anticipation of consistent, reliable motion. Rail grades were gentle, curves were engineered for smooth travel, and depots were positioned for centralized control. I examined early patents and technical discussions related to transport from the same era. Some references assume the availability of motive power beyond animal labor, though they stop short of detailing it. The language is cautious, technical, and often incomplete. Operational coherence is another consideration. Timetables, where they survive, show synchronized movement across multiple lines. This level of coordination is difficult to achieve without centralized planning and predictable energy input. The scale of investment further supports a system-level view. Cities committed enormous resources to these grids in short time frames. Such investment suggests confidence in long-term utility rather than temporary experimentation. Importantly, this interpretation does not require extraordinary claims. Systems do not imply unknown technologies. They imply organization, planning, and shared assumptions about how cities should function. What raises questions is not that these systems existed, but how quickly they were abandoned. If they were coherent enough to justify their construction, what changed so rapidly that removal became preferable to adaptation? Official explanation attributes this shift to technological progress, yet the speed and uniformity of transition suggest additional factors at play. Systems built as integrated networks are not easily discarded unless broader frameworks change. Chapter 4 represents the core of my investigation because it reframes the transport grids as systems rather than relics. This reframing does not provide answers, but it aligns disparate evidence into a coherent picture. Understanding these networks as systems also clarifies why their removal would require administrative coordination rather than incremental change. Dismantling, rebranding, and administrative silence. With a system-level framework in place, I returned to the question of removal. The dismantling of early transport grids was rarely traumatic. It occurred through planning decisions, reconstruction efforts, and reclassification. Municipal records often describe rail removal as part of street improvement. Rails were paved over, tunnels sealed, depots repurposed. The language emphasized cleanliness, safety, and modernization rather than loss. In some cities, former transport corridors became utility routes or roadways. Infrastructure was absorbed rather than destroyed. This rebranding obscured original function. Wars and disasters accelerated these processes. Reconstruction offered opportunities to redesign cities without restoring previous systems. Decisions were framed as practical responses rather than strategic shifts. What I found consistently was a lack of detailed explanation. Removal orders list actions but not reasoning. There is little discussion of alternatives, cost-benefit analysis, or public input. This administrative silence is significant. Systems that once structured urban life were removed with minimal documentation. Over time, absence became normal. Educational narratives followed. Early transport was reframed as primitive, justifying its disappearance. Museums displayed artifacts without context, emphasizing technological inevitability. I found no evidence of deliberate suppression. What I found was something quieter: omission. When systems are removed without explanation, future generations inherit simplified stories. The erasure was procedural rather than dramatic. It occurred through planning language, archive selection, and historical framing. By the time modern transport systems were fully established, the earlier grids existed only as fragments: buried rails, repurposed tunnels, unexplained structures. This process did not require conspiracy. It required consensus. Modern transit, centralization, and open questions. Today, urban transport is centralized, regulated, and standardized. Networks are efficient, but they are also rigid. Cities depend on systems that are capital-intensive and vulnerable to disruption. As I reflect on the evidence, I am struck by how thoroughly earlier alternatives have been forgotten. The transport grids I examined are remembered only as primitive predecessors, if at all. The evidence suggests that cities once experimented with dense, integrated networks whose logic does not fully align with modern narratives. Whether these systems were optimal is not the question. Whether they deserve re-examination is. What stands out is not technological loss, but conceptual loss. When systems are removed without explanation, inquiry ends. I do not claim these networks were superior. I do not claim they were intentionally erased. What I claim is that their disappearance was quiet, and quiet transitions are easy to forget. Modern systems reflect modern priorities: centralization, scalability, control. Earlier grids may have reflected different assumptions. The question remains open. Why were these systems built the way they were? Why were they removed so uniformly? And what other frameworks have we accepted without revisiting what came before? These are not conclusions. They are invitations to look again.